Marcus Wellington had everything a man could dream of. At 38 years old, he commanded a financial empire worth over $50 million, owned 3 luxury homes across different continents, and drove cars that most people only saw in magazines. His penthouse overlooking Central Park was a testament to his success, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of a city that seemed to bow at his feet. But perhaps his greatest prize, or so he believed, was Elena Rodriguez, the woman who had stood by his side for 7 years through his meteoric rise from a struggling investment banker to one of New York's most powerful financiers. Elena wasn't just beautiful, though her warm brown eyes and gentle smile could light up any room. She possessed something far more valuable in a world obsessed with superficiality: genuine loyalty. When Marcus was working 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination, Elena would bring him homemade meals to his tiny office. When his first major deal fell through and he considered giving up, she held him through the night, whispering words of encouragement that became the foundation of his resilience. She celebrated his victories as if they were her own and mourned his defeats with a pain that matched his own. Elena was more than his girlfriend. She was his anchor, his conscience, and the beating heart behind his ambition. Their relationship had weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser bonds. The stress of his career, the long absences during business trips, the constant pressure of high-stakes negotiations. Through it all, Elena remained steadfast. She never complained about the missed dinners, the canceled vacations, or the nights she fell asleep alone while he worked late into the morning. Instead, she created a sanctuary in their home, a place where Marcus could shed the armor of his professional persona and simply be human. She saw through the expensive suits and the commanding presence to the insecure young man who still feared failure, and she loved every vulnerable part of him that he tried to hide from the world. But success, they say, changes a man, and Marcus Wellington was no exception. As his wealth multiplied and his influence expanded, so did his exposure to a world where beauty was currency and loyalty was a luxury few could afford. The charity galas, exclusive parties, and high society events became a regular part of his calendar, and with them came encounters with women who moved through these circles like predators sensing opportunity. They were different from Elena, polished, sophisticated, with beauty so carefully crafted it seemed almost artificial. Yet there was something intoxicating about their attention, the way they laughed at his jokes a little too enthusiastically, the way they looked at him, as if he were a prize to be won rather than a man to be loved. It was at one of these events, a lavish fundraiser for children's education, that Marcus first laid eyes on Sophia Beaumont. She glided across the ballroom floor like she owned it, her platinum blonde hair catching the chandelier light, her emerald dress hugging curves that seemed designed by a master sculptor. At 25, she was already an established model with campaigns for luxury brands across Europe and America. But it wasn't just her physical beauty that captivated Marcus. It was the way she carried herself, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, as if the world existed solely for her pleasure. Their first conversation was intoxicating. Sophia spoke of her travels, her encounters with celebrities and royalty, her life of perpetual glamour and excitement. She painted a picture of a world where every day was an adventure, where ordinary concerns didn't exist, where beauty and wealth were the only currencies that mattered. When she laughed, it was like music specifically composed to seduce successful men like Marcus. When she touched his arm during conversation, it sent electricity through his body that he hadn't felt in years. She represented everything that Elena wasn't: dangerous, unpredictable, and utterly selfish in the most alluring way possible. That night, as Marcus returned home to find Elena asleep in their bed, her nursing textbooks scattered around her as she had fallen asleep studying for her master's degree, something fundamental shifted inside him. Looking at her peaceful face, he felt not love and gratitude, but a strange sense of confinement, as if her very presence reminded him of a simpler, smaller version of himself that he no longer wished to be. The weeks following that first encounter became a carefully orchestrated dance of deception. Marcus found himself manufacturing reasons to attend events where he might see Sophia again. Board meetings that could have been handled remotely suddenly required his physical presence in cities where she happened to be modeling. Business dinners stretched longer than necessary when she was in town. Each meeting felt like playing with fire, and Marcus discovered he had developed an addiction to the burn. Sophia, with the calculated precision of a woman who had turned seduction into an art form, made herself just available enough to keep him intrigued, but never so accessible that the chase would end. Elena, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around their relationship. She continued her routine with the same dedication that had always defined her character. Morning coffee prepared exactly how Marcus liked it, his favorite meals waiting when he returned from his increasingly frequent business trips, gentle questions about his day that he answered with growing irritation. She was completing her master's degree in nursing, driven by a desire to give back to the community that had supported her immigrant family. Her dreams were simple but profound: to heal others, to build a family with Marcus, to create a legacy of love rather than wealth. But Marcus, intoxicated by Sophia's world of superficial glamour, began to see Elena's genuine nature as naive rather than noble, her loyalty as suffocating rather than supportive. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual erosion of the man Elena had fallen in love with, like watching a beautiful sculpture slowly weather away until only a cold, unrecognizable form remained. Marcus began criticizing things he had once cherished about her. Her preference for quiet evenings at home became boring. Her casual style of dress seemed unsophisticated compared to Sophia's designer everything. Even her accent, which had once charmed him with its musical quality, now struck him as embarrassing in front of his high society acquaintances. The cruelest part was that Elena noticed every change and blamed herself, working harder to please a man who was already emotionally gone. Sophia, for her part, played her role with masterful precision. She understood that men like Marcus weren't won through direct pursuit, but through the illusion of conquest. She would be warm and flirtatious one day, then mysteriously unavailable the next. She would share intimate details about her glamorous life, making him feel special to be trusted with such information, then casually mention other wealthy men who were pursuing her, ensuring his competitive nature stayed engaged. She knew exactly when to be vulnerable, sharing carefully crafted stories about her difficult childhood that made Marcus feel like her protector, and when to be untouchable, reminding him that she was a prize many men desired but few could claim. The affair began on a rainy Thursday evening in Marcus's private office. Elena was at the hospital, completing a clinical rotation that would keep her there until midnight. Sophia had called, claiming to be heartbroken over a failed photo shoot, needing someone to talk to. She arrived at his office in a trench coat that barely covered a silk dress, her mascara artfully smudged to suggest tears, her vulnerability so perfectly performed that Marcus felt like both her savior and her conquest. What happened next was inevitable, a culmination of weeks of careful orchestration and growing desire. As the city lights twinkled below them through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus crossed a line he had never imagined he would cross, betraying not just Elena, but the very foundation of who he believed himself to be. The guilt that followed was crushing, but temporary. Sophia knew exactly how to handle a man experiencing post-betrayal remorse. She didn't demand commitments or make scenes. Instead, she made him feel like what they shared was special, fated, too powerful to resist. She spoke of love as if it were a force of nature, something that couldn't be controlled or denied. She painted their affair not as a betrayal of Elena, but as a discovery of their true selves, a connection so profound that conventional morality simply didn't apply. Marcus, desperate to justify his actions, embraced this narrative with the fervor of a convert to a new religion. As months passed, the double life became easier to maintain. Marcus grew skilled at compartmentalizing his existence. The dutiful boyfriend who came home to Elena with practiced affection, and the passionate lover who lost himself in Sophia's intoxicating world. But maintaining such deception required an increasingly elaborate web of lies. Business trips that didn't exist, meetings with clients who were never consulted, charitable events that were really romantic getaways. Each lie built upon the last, until Marcus himself sometimes forgot which version of his life was real. The decision to leave Elena didn't come as a moment of passion or sudden realization. It was calculated, methodical, the same cold precision Marcus applied to his most ruthless business deals. He had convinced himself that staying with Elena was holding him back from his true potential, that a man of his stature deserved a woman who could match his success and social standing. Sophia had subtly planted these seeds during their most intimate moments, whispering how perfect they looked together, how other couples at high society events couldn't compare to their combined beauty and power. She spoke of Elena with just enough pity to make Marcus feel justified in his growing resentment, describing her as sweet but simple, and suggesting that Marcus was outgrowing their relationship like an expensive suit that no longer fit. The breakup itself was a masterpiece of cruelty disguised as kindness. Marcus chose a quiet Sunday morning when Elena was making pancakes, humming softly to herself as she prepared what had become their weekly ritual. The domestic scene that once filled him with warmth now felt suffocating. A symbol of the ordinary life he was determined to escape. He sat at their kitchen table, the same table where Elena had celebrated every one of his business victories, and delivered the words that would shatter her world with the detached efficiency of a corporate restructuring. He spoke of growing apart, of needing space to find himself, of wanting different things. He never mentioned Sophia, convincing himself that this omission was mercy rather than cowardice. Elena's reaction was everything Marcus had feared and secretly hoped for. She didn't scream or throw things or demand explanations. Instead, she simply crumpled, like a flower suddenly deprived of sunlight. She asked if there was someone else, her voice barely above a whisper, and Marcus looked directly in her eyes and lied with a conviction that surprised even him. The tears that followed were silent, heartbroken sobs that seemed to echo through the penthouse long after she had gathered her few belongings and left. As the door closed behind her, Marcus felt not relief but a strange emptiness, as if something essential had been torn from his chest. But Sophia's call came within the hour, her sultry voice promising celebration and new beginnings, and Marcus pushed away any lingering doubts about his decision. The transition from Elena to Sophia happened with shocking swiftness. Within 2 weeks, Sophia had moved into the penthouse, transforming it from a warm home into a showcase for her extensive wardrobe and beauty routines. The personal touches Elena had added, family photos, handmade ceramics from local artists, books worn soft from repeated reading, were replaced by professional photographs of Sophia's modeling career and abstract art pieces selected more for their price tags than their emotional resonance. The space became beautiful in the way museum displays are beautiful, perfect, untouchable, and somehow lacking in soul. Marcus threw himself into his new relationship with the same intensity he applied to hostile takeovers. He showered Sophia with gifts that made headlines in society magazines, diamond necklaces that cost more than most people's houses, designer gowns flown in from Paris fashion houses, weekend trips to private islands where they were photographed by paparazzi who seemed to appear wherever Sophia went. Each extravagant gesture was documented on social media, creating a narrative of perfect love and ultimate success that Marcus began to believe himself. The comments from their high society friends reinforced this fantasy. They were the golden couple, the embodiment of what wealth and beauty could achieve when properly combined. But beneath the surface glamour, cracks were already beginning to show. Sophia's love came with conditions and expectations that Elena had never imposed. She required constant attention, expensive maintenance, and a lifestyle that consumed resources at an alarming rate. Her moods were as changeable as the weather, sunny and adoring one moment, cold and demanding the next. She had opinions about Marcus's friends, his business associates, even his family, gradually isolating him from anyone who might question their relationship. When Marcus's mother expressed concern about the speed of their relationship and asked about Elena, Sophia's reaction was swift and brutal. She accused his mother of being jealous of their happiness and threatened to leave if Marcus didn't choose between them. Marcus, terrified of losing his prize, chose Sophia, adding another relationship to the growing list of casualties from his new life. The proposal happened exactly 6 months after Elena had walked out of the penthouse. Marcus had planned it with the same attention to detail he brought to million-dollar deals, consulting with event planners, photographers, and even a PR firm to ensure maximum impact. The setting was the rooftop of the city's most exclusive hotel, with the Manhattan skyline serving as a backdrop for what would become one of the most shared engagement photos of the year. The ring itself was a masterpiece of excess. A 10-carat diamond surrounded by emeralds, custom designed by a jeweler whose client list read like a who's who of international royalty. When Sophia said yes, her tears of joy seemed genuine, and for a moment, Marcus felt the validation he had been seeking. He had won the ultimate prize, claimed the woman every man desired, proved that Marcus Wellington could have anything and anyone he wanted. The wedding was nothing short of a spectacle that would be talked about in New York social circles for years to come. Marcus spared no expense in creating what the society magazines would later call the wedding of the decade. The ceremony took place at a historic mansion in the Hamptons, with over 300 guests including celebrities, politicians, and titans of industry. Sophia wore a custom Valentino gown that took 6 months to create, adorned with over 1,000 hand-sewn pearls and crystals. The reception featured a 7-course meal prepared by a Michelin-starred chef, entertainment by Grammy-winning artists, and floral arrangements that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Every detail was photographed and documented, creating a fairy tale narrative that would be featured in magazines around the world. But even on what should have been the happiest day of his life, Marcus felt a strange disconnection from the events unfolding around him. As he stood at the altar watching Sophia glide down the aisle, he found himself thinking not of their future together, but of Elena, wondering where she was and whether she had seen the engagement announcement in the papers. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome, a shadow across what was supposed to be his moment of triumph. When the officiant asked if he took Sophia to be his lawfully wedded wife, Marcus's "I do" felt more like a business agreement than a declaration of love. Sophia's kiss was perfect, practiced, performed for the cameras that captured every angle of their supposed bliss. The honeymoon destination was as carefully chosen as everything else in their relationship, a private island in the Caribbean that had hosted royalty and Hollywood legends. The villa was a masterpiece of luxury, with infinity pools that seemed to blend with the ocean, private beaches where they could sunbathe without interruption, and staff who anticipated their every need before it was even expressed. Sophia looked magnificent in the tropical setting, her body bronzed to perfection, her every movement worthy of the fashion photographers who had made her famous. For Marcus, it should have been paradise, the ultimate validation of his success and desirability. Yet something was fundamentally wrong, though Marcus couldn't quite articulate what it was. Sophia seemed more interested in documenting their honeymoon for social media than actually experiencing it with him. Every sunset was an opportunity for the perfect photograph, every romantic dinner a chance to showcase her designer resort wear, every intimate moment interrupted by the need to capture the right angle for her millions of followers. Marcus began to feel less like a husband and more like a prop in Sophia's elaborate performance of the perfect life. Their conversations, when they happened at all, revolved around surface-level topics. Which restaurant to try next? What excursion would photograph best? How many likes her latest post had received? When Marcus attempted to discuss deeper subjects, his thoughts about their future, his concerns about work, his reflections on their relationship, Sophia's eyes would glaze over with barely concealed boredom. She would redirect the conversation back to herself, to her career opportunities, to the parties they would attend when they returned to New York. Marcus realized with growing unease that he knew very little about Sophia's inner life, her fears, her dreams beyond fame and luxury, her capacity for the kind of deep emotional connection he had once shared with Elena. The third night of their honeymoon brought an unexpected moment of vulnerability. Marcus had drunk more wine than usual during dinner, loosened by the tropical atmosphere and the strange melancholy that had been building since their arrival. He found himself talking about his childhood, about the poverty his family had endured, about the drive that had pushed him to succeed against all odds. He spoke about his fears of failure, about the loneliness that sometimes came with success, about his desire to build something meaningful beyond just accumulating wealth. For a moment, Sophia seemed to listen with genuine interest, her hand resting on his arm in what felt like real intimacy rather than performed affection. But when Marcus finished speaking, Sophia's response revealed the vast chasm between them. She laughed, a sound like crystal breaking, and told him he was being too serious for their honeymoon. She suggested they take more photos by the pool instead, saying the lighting would be perfect for her next Instagram post. The moment of potential connection vanished like morning mist, leaving Marcus feeling more isolated than ever. As he watched his new wife pose against the sunset, her beauty undeniable, but her indifference equally clear, Marcus felt the first real stirring of regret about the choices that had led him to this golden cage. That night, as Sophia slept beside him in their luxurious suite, Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about Elena. He wondered what she was doing, whether she had moved on, whether she ever thought about him with anything other than pain and anger. He tried to push these thoughts away, reminding himself of all the reasons he had left her, all the ways Sophia was superior. But in the darkness, with only the sound of waves lapping against the shore, Marcus couldn't escape the growing certainty that he had made a terrible mistake, trading something real and precious for something beautiful, but ultimately hollow. The call came on the fourth morning of their honeymoon, just as Marcus was emerging from the infinity pool where he had been swimming laps to clear his head from another restless night. Sophia was still asleep in their villa, exhausted from the previous evening's elaborate photo shoot, disguised as a romantic dinner on the beach. Marcus had been grateful for the solitude, using the early morning hours to try to reconcile the growing disconnect between the paradise he was supposed to be experiencing and the emptiness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. The phone's insistent buzzing cut through the tropical tranquility like a blade, and Marcus answered without checking the caller ID, assuming it was his assistant with some minor business matter that couldn't wait. Instead, he heard the familiar voice of Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Elena's supervisor at the hospital where she was completing her nursing program. Marcus hadn't spoken to Dr. Hendricks since Elena had left, but he remembered her as a woman who didn't waste words on pleasantries. Her voice carried a weight that immediately commanded his attention, cutting through the tropical morning like a cold wind from another world. She apologized for interrupting his honeymoon, explaining that she had gotten his number from Elena's emergency contact information. The words that followed would replay in Marcus's mind for the rest of his life, each syllable etched into his memory with crystal clarity. Elena had collapsed during her shift 3 days earlier, Dr. Hendricks explained. What they had initially assumed was exhaustion from her rigorous study schedule, and the emotional stress of their breakup had revealed itself to be something far more serious. The blood tests had come back that morning, and the results painted a picture that no one had been prepared for. Elena had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, an aggressive form of cancer that had already begun ravaging her body with silent efficiency. The doctors estimated that she had been sick for months, possibly even during the final stages of their relationship, fighting a battle she hadn't even known she was waging. Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet as Dr. Hendricks continued speaking. The medical terminology washed over him in waves. Blast cells, bone marrow, chemotherapy protocols, survival statistics that sounded more like stock market projections than discussions of human life. But beneath the clinical language was a more personal message that Dr. Hendricks delivered with careful professionalism. Elena had been asking for him. Even after everything that had happened between them, even after the way he had discarded their 7-year relationship like yesterday's newspaper, she wanted to see him. She was scared, alone, and facing the fight of her life with the same quiet dignity that had characterized everything she did. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was receiving this news while standing in paradise, surrounded by luxury that most people could only dream of, married to a woman who epitomized physical perfection. As Dr. Hendricks spoke about treatment options and the aggressive timeline they were facing, Marcus found himself looking at the pristine beach, the crystal-clear water, the villa where his new wife slept peacefully, and feeling like he was viewing someone else's life through a window. The tropical paradise that had felt hollow and performative suddenly seemed obscene in its excess, a glittering distraction from the real world, where people he had loved were fighting battles that money couldn't win. Marcus asked the questions that any decent human being would ask. What was Elena's prognosis? What were her treatment options? Did she have family support? Dr. Hendricks answered each query with the measured precision of someone who delivered devastating news as part of their daily routine. The prognosis was guarded but not hopeless, she explained. Elena was young and had been in good health before the diagnosis, which worked in her favor. The treatment would be aggressive and would require months of intensive chemotherapy, followed by possible stem cell transplantation if the initial treatment wasn't sufficient. As for family support, Elena's parents had flown in from Puerto Rico, but they spoke limited English and were overwhelmed by the medical complexity of their daughter's situation. But it was Dr. Hendrick's final observation that cut Marcus to the bone with surgical precision. She mentioned, almost casually, that Elena had been experiencing symptoms for months before her collapse. The fatigue that Marcus had attributed to her demanding study schedule, the weight loss he had barely noticed in his distraction with Sophia, the occasional shortness of breath that Elena had dismissed as stress, all of it had been her body's desperate attempts to signal that something was wrong. While Marcus had been planning his betrayal, orchestrating his escape from their relationship, and pursuing his selfish desires, Elena had been slowly dying, and neither of them had known it. The call ended with Dr. Hendricks providing the hospital's contact information and Elena's room number, though she made no explicit request for Marcus to visit. The decision, she made clear, was entirely his to make. As Marcus stood in the morning sun, the phone still clutched in his trembling hand, he felt the careful constructed narrative of his new life crumbling around him like a house built on sand. Everything that had seemed so important just moments before, the perfect honeymoon, the trophy wife, the validation of his success, suddenly appeared grotesquely trivial in the face of Elena's mortality. Behind him, he heard Sophia stirring in the villa, her voice calling out sleepily, asking who had been on the phone. Marcus turned to look at the woman he had married, beautiful even in the morning light, already reaching for her phone to check her social media notifications. The question hung in the tropical air between them, loaded with implications that would determine the course of all their lives. Marcus stood frozen on the terrace for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely moved in the sky. The phone remained clutched in his hand like evidence of a crime he couldn't deny, while behind him Sophia's voice grew more insistent, demanding to know who had called and why he was acting so strange. When he finally turned to face her, Marcus saw his new wife through completely different eyes. The morning light that should have made her look radiant instead seemed to highlight the calculated perfection of her appearance. The way even her casual honeymoon attire was carefully chosen to create the illusion of effortless beauty. Her concern about the phone call wasn't born from worry about his well-being, but from irritation that something had disrupted her carefully planned paradise. Marcus tried to explain what he had learned, choosing his words carefully as he described Elena's diagnosis and the gravity of her situation. He watched Sophia's face as he spoke, searching for some sign of empathy, some recognition of the human tragedy unfolding beyond their luxurious bubble. Instead, he saw calculation, the same expression she wore when deciding which designer dress would photograph better against different backgrounds. Her first question wasn't about Elena's prognosis or treatment options, but about whether this would affect their remaining honeymoon days. Her second question was whether this meant they would need to cut their trip short, delivered with the kind of petulance usually reserved for inconvenient flight delays. The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental difference between the woman Marcus had married and the woman he had abandoned. Sophia made it clear that she considered Elena's illness to be ancient history, irrelevant to their new life together. She pointed out, with ruthless logic, that Marcus and Elena were no longer together, that he had made his choice, and that getting involved in his ex-girlfriend's medical crisis would only complicate their marriage unnecessarily. She spoke about Elena the way one might discuss an outdated business partnership, something that belonged to Marcus's past and should remain there. When Marcus suggested that basic human decency required some response to Elena's situation, Sophia's mask of understanding slipped completely. The argument that erupted shattered the carefully maintained illusion of their perfect honeymoon. Sophia accused Marcus of still being in love with Elena, of using her illness as an excuse to reconnect with his former girlfriend. She threatened to leave him if he showed any signs of getting involved in Elena's care, painting his concern as betrayal of their new marriage. Her tears, when they came, seemed more angry than hurt, the rage of someone who had invested considerable time and effort in securing a prize, only to see it potentially slip away. Marcus found himself looking at a woman he had thought he loved, and seeing a stranger, someone capable of viewing another person's life-threatening illness, as nothing more than an inconvenience. That afternoon, while Sophia sulked by the pool and posted increasingly dramatic messages on social media about the challenges of married life, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his story. He called his private jet service and arranged for an immediate return in New York, telling Sophia they had a family emergency that required his presence. The lie came easily, though Marcus told himself it wasn't really a lie. Elena had been family in every way that mattered for 7 years, and her emergency was more real than anything else in his carefully constructed life. Sophia's reaction to the news was volcanic. She screamed about ruined vacation plans, about the money wasted on their remaining honeymoon days, about how this would look to their friends and social media followers. She accused Marcus of humiliating her, of choosing his ex-girlfriend over his wife, of being weak and sentimental. But beneath her fury, Marcus detected something else: fear. Sophia understood, perhaps better than Marcus himself, that his decision to leave their honeymoon represented more than just a response to Elena's illness. It was a crack in the foundation of their relationship, a sign that the hold she thought she had secured over him might not be as strong as she had believed. The flight back to New York was a nightmare of tension and recrimination. Sophia alternated between icy silence and explosive anger, making phone calls to her friends to complain about Marcus's ridiculous decision and posting cryptic social media messages that hinted at marital problems without providing details. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself thinking about Elena with a clarity that had been absent for months. He remembered not just her beauty or her loyalty, but her capacity for genuine concern about others, her ability to put someone else's needs before her own, her instinct to heal rather than harm. As the plane descended toward New York, Marcus realized that the phone call from Dr. Hendricks had done more than inform him of Elena's diagnosis. It had forced him to confront the man he had become, the successful businessman who could justify any decision in terms of personal advancement, the husband who had married for status rather than love, the human being who had walked away from someone who loved him unconditionally in pursuit of someone who loved only what he could provide. Looking out at the city lights below, Marcus understood that he was returning to face not just Elena's illness, but his own moral crisis. Sophia, staring at her reflection in the plane window and touching up her makeup for their arrival, had no idea that the man sitting beside her was already planning his next betrayal, this time of her. The hospital corridors felt like a different universe from the luxury resort they had left behind just hours earlier. The sterile smell of disinfectant, the harsh fluorescent lighting, and the constant symphony of medical equipment created an atmosphere that stripped away all pretense and forced confrontation with life's most fundamental realities. Marcus walked these hallways alone, having left Sophia in their penthouse where she had barricaded herself in the master bedroom, making increasingly frantic phone calls to friends and family about her husband's breakdown and demanding that someone talk sense in him. Her parting words had been an ultimatum delivered with the cold precision of a business negotiation. Choose Elena, or choose their marriage, but understand that she would not share her husband with a ghost from his past. Elena's room was at the end of a long corridor in the oncology ward, and with each step Marcus took toward it, he felt the weight of his choices bearing down on him like a physical force. Through the small window in the door, he could see her lying in the hospital bed, connected to various machines that monitored and sustained her failing body. Even diminished by illness and medical intervention, Elena retained a dignity and grace that made Marcus's throat tighten with recognition and regret. Her parents sat beside her bed, holding her hands and speaking in soft Spanish, their faces etched with the particular anguish that comes from watching a child suffer while feeling powerless to help. When Marcus finally entered the room, the conversation stopped immediately. Elena's parents looked at him with expressions that mixed surprise, confusion, and barely contained hostility. They knew about the breakup, about how their daughter had come home devastated and heartbroken, though Elena had never revealed the full extent of Marcus's betrayal or the existence of Sophia. Elena herself turned toward the door with eyes that seemed both older and younger than when he had last seen her, aged by suffering, but brightened by a hope she tried to suppress. The silence stretched between them, filled with 7 years of shared history and months of painful separation. Elena was the first to speak, her voice weaker than Marcus remembered, but carrying the same warmth that had sustained him through his darkest professional moments. She thanked him for coming, apologizing for Dr. Hendricks contacting him during his honeymoon, expressing concern about disrupting his new life. Even facing her own mortality, Elena's first instinct was to worry about inconveniencing others, to minimize her own needs in deference to what she perceived as more important priorities. Marcus felt his carefully constructed justifications for leaving her crumble completely as he listened to her speak with the same selfless concern that had characterized their entire relationship. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in months of superficial exchanges with Sophia. Elena asked about his life, his happiness, his hopes for the future, and Marcus found himself unable to answer with the confident assertions of satisfaction he had been rehearsing. Instead, he found himself talking about his business with a hollow tone that made his success sound meaningless, describing his new marriage with words that felt like reading from a script he didn't believe. Elena listened with the same attention she had always given him, nodding and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in his well-being rather than judgment about his choices. But it was when Elena began talking about her own experience that Marcus truly understood what he had lost. She spoke about her diagnosis with remarkable composure, explaining the treatment plan and discussing her prognosis with the clinical precision of someone who had forced herself to understand every detail of her condition. She talked about her fears, not just of dying, but of leaving things unfinished, of not being able to complete her nursing program, of not having the chance to help as many people as she had hoped. She mentioned her regrets, and Marcus braced himself for accusations about their relationship. But instead she expressed sorrow about not traveling more, not learning to paint, not telling the people she loved how much they meant to her often enough. As the hours passed and visiting time drew to a close, Marcus realized that Elena had never once asked him why he had really left her, never demanded explanations or apologies, never made him feel guilty for the choices he had made. She simply accepted his presence as a gift, treasuring their time together without trying to extract promises or commitments for the future. When he finally stood to leave, Elena reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently and telling him she was glad he was happy, even though they both knew he wasn't. Walking back through the hospital corridors toward the parking garage, Marcus felt like a man emerging from a long, disorienting dream. The past 8 months of his life seemed suddenly unreal, an elaborate performance he had staged for an audience that didn't actually care about his happiness. The penthouse that awaited him, with its expensive furnishings and his beautiful, angry wife, felt like a prison he had built for himself out of pride and shallow desires. Elena's hospital room, with its medical equipment and uncertain future, had felt more like home than anywhere he had been since the day she walked out of his life. Marcus sat in his car in the hospital parking garage for over an hour, his phone buzzing constantly, with increasingly hysterical messages from Sophia, demanding to know where he was and when he was coming home. But home, he realized, wasn't the penthouse or the luxury lifestyle or the trophy wife who loved his money more than his soul. Home was wherever Elena was, fighting her battle with quiet courage, facing an uncertain future with the same grace she had brought to everything else in her life. Marcus understood now that success without substance was just an expensive form of emptiness, that beauty without depth was merely decoration, and that love without sacrifice was nothing more than transaction. As he finally started his car and drove away from the hospital, Marcus Wellington began planning the most important deal of his life, not a business acquisition or financial maneuver, but the reclamation of his own humanity and the chance to stand beside the woman he should never have left, no matter what it cost him.